Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Big Questions, Small Steps. My name is Amanda, and I'm so glad that you could join me today. Today, we are going to be doing a great one. We are going to be talking about the practices within the Jehovah Witness organization to help guide or steer or encourage obedience of their followers. We're going to be talking about the practice known by some as shunning, or others know it as disfellowship. We're going to be talking about those practices and the different levels and what happens and why it happens. So get ready, because it's going to be a good one. Let's hit the intro and we'll begin. So with any group, you're going to have people who follow what you say and people who don't. And in the Jehovah Witnesses, they believe that obedience to God and the obedience to the organization is closely tied. And they believe that not only are they responsible for their own obedience, but they also believe that they are responsible for holding each other accountable for their obedience to God. And they believe that when you sin or you do something against one of the members in your community, you're also doing that to God. And so sinning and working against what they believe is very much discouraged. Their main focus in the Jehovah Witnesses is to encourage obedience above all else. And they utilize different ways of shunning or discipline in order to encourage that offending person to repent and correct their ways. Now, it may just be me, but that encouraging obedience kind of makes me hesitant. I get a little bit nervous because I want to make sure that people are still making choices, because God created our free will and making choices. And so simple obedience, I don't believe means as much as when you choose to do different acts. Me personally. Okay, tangent done. So let's talk about their different shunning or redirecting or whatever you want to call it, discipline path, okay? So there are a multitude of different sins or actions that would cause you to fall into this disfellowship, disobedience stage. So let's talk about some of the sins. Abortion, adultery, anal or oral sex, bestiality, the celebration of a birthday, the celebration of any other holiday, a blood transfusion recipient, competing in boxing, which seemed odd to me, association with a shunned individual, engaging in drug abuse or ingesting drugs, drunkenness, fraud, gambling, gluttony, greed, homosexuality, participating with a hypnotist, that was intriguing to me, idolatry, interfaith activity or learning about other faiths, can't do it, lying, manslaughter, military service, physical uncleanliness, and they do note that that's supposed to be extreme physical uncleanliness, not like if you just skip brushing your hair for one day or something like that. Having political activity noted, viewing pornography or creating pornography, refusal to provide for your family, theft, use of tobacco, verbal abuse, violence, voting, and they also note that if your job that you chose to work outside of the home has a part of that sin in that job, so like I had mentioned earlier about the waitress bringing their table wine, that would be a sin, that would be a huge problem. If you were a cashier and you sold somebody a lottery ticket, that's gambling. That's a huge problem. That sin that you are selling, you providing with your job is still a shunnable offense, still a disciplinary offense. Okay, now if you do one of those, because that's quite a lot. Most people wouldn't do one of those on a daily basis by any means, but it's still, you could see very easily how one portion of that may fall into a shunnable offense. If you were at a party where there was alcohol and you didn't leave right away, shunnable offense, because you're around people who are getting drunk. If you are acting in a loud way, or if you're having an argument, one would even say that could potentially be verbal abuse. Just different things like that. So there are different levels depending on the severity. So we're going to go through them. So the first level, the most minor offense, you would have what's known as personal counseling. An elder would come and speak with the offending person and would encourage them to confess what they did wrong. Now that's important, because it's important for the person who did something wrong to admit that they did something wrong in all of these cases. Okay? If the offense is inappropriate but not of great gravity, so maybe they were bringing a glass of wine because they needed that. Okay, well, it's a sin, but it's not like a terrible, terrible sin. The elder would provide recommendations for further self and family discipline. How can they change the situation so this wouldn't happen again? Maybe they should speak to their manager. Maybe they should go work at a different restaurant where they don't sell alcohol. Things like that. Okay, so with that guidance from the elder, that would be considered the level of correction that they would need. And if the counsel is accepted of what the counselor, the offending person, if they accept what the elder said, the issue's dropped. It's no longer an issue. It's not a problem anymore. Life goes on. If the offending person is a bit more belligerent and doesn't accept the counseling, then it would escalate and move to the next step. What's the next step? Glad you asked. Let me tell you about it. So the next step would be known as shepherding. So this time there would be at least 2, if not 3 elders, and they basically would schedule a time to come and meet and provide very clear direction with the offending person. And they would talk about what happened with the person. Again, the person would be encouraged to admit or confess what they did. And they would basically provide a little bit more oomph behind that discussion and give some continual guidance, check in a little bit more frequently. And they would also set up clear expectations of what they were expecting from the offending person moving forward. Okay? And then based on what they were seeing, if the offending person accepts their counsel and they observed what they were hoping to observe, after a period of time, the issue would be dropped. They would no longer be in punishment. They would no longer be in restrictions. They would be part of the fold. Everything would be good. For a little bit of time, they would be set aside from the group. They would have to sit in that back room in the worship space. They couldn't participate in cleaning the church. They couldn't do certain privileges within the church because they were under counsel. They were under discipline. They needed to be taught a lesson. Okay? If they didn't accept the counsel, then it would go farther in the different correction process. Next up is they're going to start withholding more privileges. The preaching, the outreach activities, because that's a huge part of who they are. Cleaning the meeting rooms, taking any position that they had granted by the elders, taking that away. Now, so it's similar to the last one, but this step, if they got to this step, it would also include the public humiliation, if you want to call it that, because during a Kingdom Hall meeting, there would be an announcement And the announcements would be something to the effect of, Johnny is no longer serving in the cleaning of the Kingdom Hall capacity. Okay, if you're in the worship service and you hear that, doesn't your mind automatically go to, well, why is he not doing that? Like, oh, did something wrong with him? Did something happen to him? And so that they do it in a very blunt way and very like, nope, to the fact. They're not going to elaborate more. But you know that after that worship service, different people are going to call or talk about, well, why is he doing this? Or why can't he do the cleaning up of the church anymore, of the Kingdom Hall anymore? Or they're going to go specifically to him and find out what's going on. And he's now got to tell or have his discretions told behind his back to all these different people who are part of his life. So it's that social pressure to, okay, fine, you weren't gonna behave and do what we said before. Okay, here's a little bit more humiliation. Maybe now this will be motive for you to kick it in gear. Okay. And that, again, is made known publicly. It's humiliation. They will stay in this stage until the elders are seeing that this individual is repentant. They are doing what's expected of them. Things are changing. And then they'll slowly gain those privileges back and things like that. If they continue to not, then they will advance to the next level, which is known as marking. Okay? The marking is for a person who continually needs counseling or is not obeying or not conforming to the counseling. And basically it will be an official written warning talk. And what will happen is now the whole entire congregation, during one of these weekend where the elder is talking about the Bible, they're going to also do this warning talk of, oh, let's talk about adultery. And they're just repeatedly talking about this thing. They don't say the individual's name, but they do note the transgression. And they indicate, and because they're talking about it, it's anybody who knows anything about this situation is supposed to encourage this offending person to repent and to change their ways and really get back into the fold. It's supposed to be that peer pressure to curtail the behaviors and get back to what you're supposed to do. So it's supposed to create that humiliation. It's supposed to create that social pressure, again, with the purpose of changing their actions so they can repent and get back into good standings within the congregation. The next level, if you've now had that written warning, the congregation talk, you've been met with multiple times, now it's up to the next level. You're no longer at the congregation level. You are brought up in what's known as local needs. So when they have the branch meetings, they are to report about the different organizations, the different congregations' activities, and your discretions, your struggles will also be listed on that local needs area. So the higher up church is now talking about this person is struggling with pornography or drug addiction or whatever. And so when that substitute teacher person comes around, they're going to have talk specifically about what that person did and why it was so bad and what they should be doing differently and giving all those different things. Again, no names are mentioned, but they will say, oh, that congregation, that Kingdom Hall in Wisconsin, they're struggling with bestiality and they have a member who's assaulting animals in this fashion or whatever. They will keep it generic and confidential, but at the same time, it's on a higher level and it's in publications because these meetings are publicized and published, and you need more support as a congregation, and that's what bringing it up to that local level, increasing that awareness, increasing that that humiliation on some regard, but at the same time, the organization receives that additional support to help this offending person. If it is continuing and that person still does not change their ways, does not conform or start to conform or show any remorse or anything like that, they will go before what's known as a committee hearing. Okay? And at this committee hearing, it'll be 3 or more elders, and it will start with a prayer to grant and ground everyone in the true meaning of why they're there. And then the accused or the offending person will be invited to make a statement. They'll be encouraged to confess to whatever sin they did. At that point, if they're still adamant that they did not do anything wrong, they will have witnesses. And it must be at least 2 witnesses who have witnessed this individual doing these offenses. And they will basically give all their information to the elders. The person will be given the offending person, will be given another chance to confess. And then if they still refuse, then the elders will meet with the offending person and the witnesses dismissed. They're going to meet, they're going to confer, they're going to do some research. They're going to then come out with one of really 3, possibly 4 different scenarios. Okay. Number 1, they're going to come out with an outcome of they determine that there was no serious sin committed, that their reports are wrong, it doesn't happen, ignore it, moving on. Number 2, they will come out with the outcome that yes, there was a sin committed, but it wasn't necessarily serious, or there were certain circumstances that absolved the accused person from doing that. So if, for example, they received a blood transfusion, but they were unconscious at the time and they couldn't be conscious and able to refuse the blood transfusion, that would be a serious sin, but one that they didn't necessarily have control over. Now, if they were in the hospital, it was a serious situation, and they said, okay, we want to do a blood transfusion, and the person said, okay, yes, let's do a blood transfusion, that's a different thing, because they were aware and they made a choice to do that. That would be the third one. It would be a serious sin, and there would be some verbal admonitions. So you're going to be spoken to quite harshly by the elders. You may have punishments for a while. You may be restricted from how you can serve your church for a while. But that will be that decision. Those admonishments, once they decide, okay, yes, it is a sin, it is a graveable sin, you can do a couple of different options. It's really just 2. So there is one that's known as reproof, and the other one is known as shunning or disfellowship, or some people even just call it removal. So let's talk about them, okay? And it's going to be that committee's decision to see which one you are. How serious was this sin that you created, okay? So the first one is going to be called reproof. And basically, you're informed in front of others who know. So if you committed adultery, for example, you would be informed of your decision, of the sentence, if you want to call it that, in front of your spouse, in front of anybody who knew about the situation. Your children would also be there, because whether they knew or not, they were a part of this situation. So to be kind of humiliated and get this sentence in front of them is supposed to hold you more accountable to converting and getting back to where you're supposed to be. So they're informed in front of the other people who knew about the transgressions, and there's restrictions imposed. And it's basically a time of watching, close monitoring by the congregation for a minimum of a year, can be more than a year, to see, is the member changing how they're acting? Are they changing or reproving themselves to be valid and desirable and deservable of being part of the Jehovah Witnesses? If they are, then eventually at the end of their reproving time, then they would be accepted back into the congregation. If they're not, then they would be released from the group. The other one, or the one that they would go to if they didn't prove themselves, is known as shunning or disfellowship or removal. They've tried to change the name throughout time because it seemed a little bit more palatable, or one would have a negative connotation. I don't know. Removal still sounds just as not good as shunning or disfellowship to me, but that's their practices. Anyways, moving on. So basically, when the offending person is not going to repent, it's a military service, they actively accepted a blood transfusion, they're associated or they learned about another religion, or they basically resigned their membership, they would do what's known as the shunning, or they didn't follow with the reproving method. They'll be handed or notified that they are being shunned or disfellowed or removed. Okay. Basically, it is a written decision, and they can appeal it, which seemed odd to me that they could appeal if somebody wanted you in the group anymore, but they can. 7 days they have to do a written appeal to the governing body. It's very rarely overturned, because if a group doesn't want you as part of their group, why would you work so hard to get back to that group? But it is overturned occasionally. And basically, once they've handed down that decision or that verdict, an announcement is made at the next meeting of the congregation, and the individual is named, as well as that not what they did wrong, but that they are shunned or removed or disfellowship. And at that point, it is also notified to the local branch that this person is now cut off. We don't have ties with them anymore. Current members, as soon as they hear that they are disfellowshipped or shunned or removed, they can no longer associate with them. You can no longer acknowledge them, and you can no longer acknowledge their presence without them themselves being at risk of discipline. So, if you are married to somebody and your spouse commits something that is worthy of shunning, you can't eat with them, you can't acknowledge them, you essentially need to either leave the church as a family, or you need to stop interacting with your spouse. And I can't imagine how you would do that. But that's what they do. So there is a lot of discussion from a lot of ex-Jehovah Witnesses, particularly children, when they choose to leave the organization and go and explore other organizations, or they marry somebody outside the faith because that's not allowed. They will be shunned or disfellowshipped or removed, and they can no longer speak to their grandparents. They can no longer speak to their parents. They can no longer speak to their siblings who are still in part of it. It feels very much like the Amish and the Mennonite shunnings, where it's supposed to protect those who are still part of the fold, and it's supposed to make that person who is being kicked out want to come back more. But from my viewpoint, all it seems to do is really pull families apart. And that's tough. Now, as I said initially, the goal of all this discipline is to draw people back, make them want to change so that they can be back in fellowship. And so to do that, it would be called reinstatement. You can be reinstated at the end of any of those different branches except shunning. Once you're shunned, you're shunned. There's been just a handful. If you've been shunned for more than 5 years, you can apply to be reinstated. But it's typically taken very, very cautiously. But reinstatement is the goal eventually. Basically, it's the goal of all people who are in discipline. They want you to be repentant and get back to the fold. And if an individual demonstrates that they are no longer practicing what they were offended, what their offense was, if they have changed, if they continue to be submissive to the group's regulations, and that phrase kind of weirds me out just a little bit, just a side note, that's submissive to the group's regulations, then an individual may apply by talking to an elder for the discipline to be removed and them to be allowed to be reinstated. Okay? If this happens after talking to the elders will then talk amongst themselves and they'll make this decision. If it is approved, then an announcement will be made at a meeting, and it would basically be saying that John is applying for reinstatement, and members at that point are encouraged to watch him and his actions very carefully and report back to the elder. The member is then watched for, depending on what his offense was, months, years, until they determine that they are sincere in their actions and they are committed to actually following through with the Jehovah Witness practices. And then they would be welcomed back in. Just interesting. I can read when I'm reading about the shunning practices and people who are ex-Jehovah Witnesses, there's a lot of hurt and there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of pushback regarding the idea that they have to conform to a group's mindset and the idea that they have to essentially be humiliated and beg for forgiveness. There's a lot of hurt, and I was not expecting that. I had never known that before. There wasn't anything I knew about. So just very, very interesting. Very interesting. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. If you did, please go ahead and like this video, hit that subscribe button, because if you've learned all about Jehovah Witnesses and you're like, that is the spot for me, I absolutely want in, you'll be excited for the next video, because we're going to talk about what the conversion path is to Jehovah Witnesses, and what would be required for you to become one. So you're not going to want to miss that one. Thank you so much for joining me today. I always appreciate the time that we have and learning together, because the more we know, the more you grow. Until next time, take care.